Hey guys, welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid and for another reading from October Nights, 31 Tales for the Halloween Season. As of this recording, it is October 23. We're only 8 days away from Halloween, and I hope the weather is as amazing where you are as it is where I am. It's been in the 80s for like the last 3 days, and I've been working on getting some some seasoned firewood under cover for the winter. And this is so weird. You know, I read the story yesterday about the have a very fairy Halloween, about the fairies, and I pointed out the pumpkin plant that was growing behind the woodpile up at our campground, which is down there. I'm sitting in a different location in the woods today. I'm up the hill some, and that's why you heard something throw something at me. I had lunch down there a couple hours ago, and something stepped behind a tree back here, and well, it's in this area, so get my 6, okay? But you remember that I talked about how I wrote this story about fairies, and they were planting seeds in different places around the property, and then lo and behold, the very next day I find a pumpkin plant that I didn't plant. And something very odd happened again today. I was getting, and it has to do with our story tonight, this evening. It's called Pumpkin Munchers, and I was getting seasoned firewood from right outside the fence of our garden where we had our pumpkin patch this year. And I looked over into the field because something caught my attention, and it was like the straw grass. We have some really odd behaving straw grass around here. It was waving back and forth like that and then going down. It looked as if something was trying to pull it underground. And I looked around, and none of the other grass was moving. There was no breeze. It was completely calm. But this thing, it was like something like a gopher or something that lived underground was trying to pull it under. And it stopped after about 10 seconds. I walked out into the field. It was only about 10 yards off the trail. And I looked around. I dug down in there. I didn't see any little animals, no mice or moles, no rabbits. And there were no, I stepped on the area. There were no tunnels. But then it occurred to me, it was probably the pumpkin munchers, because it was so close to our pumpkin garden, our pumpkin patch, which did well this year. We got more pumpkins this year than we ever have, at least the ones that grew on the fence. And you're going to find out why. The ones that were on the ground, they got munched. All right, so as my beautiful bride Dearly, aka Giggly Girl, would say, with no further ado, let's read the story for October 23, Pumpkin Munchers. And again, these books are available in print or Kindle on Amazon. The link is in the description box below. If you can't afford the book, just keep coming to the channel. I'm reading almost all the stories. There's 2 or 3 that I can't because they're not appropriate for this channel, because there's a lot of political stuff in it, and we avoid politics on here because it's divisive. And for those of you who have read those stories, those are the views of the characters, not the author. And of course, I know you understand that because of the context of the points made. However, I would encourage you, if you've not read the Bigfoot Sasquatch Files volumes 1 through 4, pick those up, from the link in the description box, because we're about a week away from volume 5 being available. Hope to have it out in time for Halloween. Okay, so here we go. With no further ado, I just made further ado. Okay, so now, with no further ado, Pumpkin Munchers. This is going to sound like something straight out of an H.P. Lovecraft story, and not because these creatures, or spirits, or monsters, or hell, whatever you call them, resemble fish in any way. They don't. But because I've only seen one other creature on Earth that lives in a similar way as they do, and those creatures happen to be fish. The ones here in this story resemble rabbits. I'm getting ahead of myself, as I have a tendency to do, so once again, let me start at the beginning. I lived for many years in the Philippine Islands, and during my first full year there, after having gone back and forth a couple of times, I decided to truly learn about the native culture. My wife, who is Filipina, and I left the city with our 10-month-old son, and we went to my wife's native province, what we might call here in the U.S. living out in the country. But there, of course, we were living out in the jungle. Now, I hear footsteps in the leaves. Keep getting my 6. Now, I could compare and contrast our cultures, the U.S. and the Philippines, and I could even compare and contrast in regard to country living here versus there all day long, but I don't have time, and that has little to do with this story. You see, the part that has to do with this story is the hito, a type of fish that closely resembles an American catfish, and that I'm sure is in the catfish family. It looks just like a channel cat, except it's black and it doesn't have whiskers. During the time we lived in my wife's province, nearly 2 years, we stayed in a bamboo hut with a leaky roof and no electricity or running water. The hut belonged to her Lola, or grandmother. Lola had about 3 acres of land, and there were roughly 3 generations of her family living on it, roughly 500 people. And no, this is not an exaggeration. At any rate, on my wife's Lola's land was a pond. Rather, what they referred to as a pond. What it actually looked like was a field of standing water, as if it had rained hard the night before and the field was sitting at a low place on the property. It was about half the size of a football field. Oh, wait a minute, I skipped the line. Okay, and the field was sitting at a low place on the property and the water was going to take a couple of days to drain. It was about half the size of a football field, not big at all, and at its deepest point, it appeared to be about a foot deep. "There are no fish in this," I said to my wife's little brother the first time he took me to Mud Puddle Pond, that's what I named it for obvious reasons, to go fishing. We had bamboo cane poles that we'd cut that morning and about 6 feet of line on each one, the end of which had a hook baited with a coconut worm. These are short, fat larvae that look like just about any type of larvae you might dig up in your backyard in the U.S., either the larvae of an oak or pine beetle or a Japanese beetle about to come up in a month or so and eat your rose bushes. "Unsa dai?" he asked his sister. This kid, about 15 years old, didn't speak a word of English. He was pretty good at nodding his head, though, as if he were following along when you spoke to him in English. My wife translated because this was before I'd learned to speak their language, Visayan, and let me tell you, living 2 years in the jungle where you either learn to speak the language of the locals or talk to no one but your wife is the greatest crash course in learning to speak a foreign language I could think of. When I left that jungle village 2 years later, I was fluent in Visayan. Kesabot ko dako Visayan ko. My wife's brother laughed and he flung his worm out into the water and stuck the end of his bamboo cane pole in the ground. I did the same and then said, "How deep is this? A foot?" And then I started to walk into the pond again, which appeared to simply be a giant mud puddle. "No," my wife and her brother said in unison, each of them grabbing me by both arms and pulling me back. My wife explained to me that the pond was underground. All we were seeing was the surface water. There was a type of fish that lived in the pond, this hito, or Filipino catfish, that made tunnels under the surface of the mud. Some of these tunnels, she said, could be 20 feet deep, and at the ends of the tunnels were giant underground caves where the fish schooled, she believed, by the hundreds. She warned that if I were to walk into the pond, I could collapse one of the tunnels and fall into one of the caves and drown. She said drunk Filipinos did it all the time. "Damn," I said, "are there really that many fish in here?" My wife and her brother said yes, though I don't really know if he was sure what he was saying yes to. But I'd find out in time that I didn't need to take their words for it. We walked away from our poles so the fish wouldn't see us standing there when they came up out of their tunnels to take the bait, and then we went back to check them 15 minutes later, and my wife's brother and I both had a hito on the line. They'd set their own hooks when they'd grabbed the coconut grubs and tried to make a run for it, so all we had to do was lift them out of the water. They were about a foot long each, which seemed to be the average size for hitos, though I'd go on to break the village record some months later by catching one that was about 2 feet long. And we would catch those things all day long, as much as we wanted. We'd simply toss our baited hooks into the water, stick the poles in the mud so the hitos couldn't drag them away, and then go back in 15 minutes and get our fish. And man, were they some good eating. Tasted just like catfish, the catfish I'd eaten so much here in the southern U.S. Fast forward about 6 years. My wife and I and our son are living on a small 6 acres homestead in central Virginia. And man, are we excited to grow and raise our own food. One of the first forms of livestock we started with on our Virginia homestead was rabbits. We tried to breed them in the Philippines, but between the hot and humid environment, rabbits are not indigenous to Southeast Asia, And though you can find them there, the death rate of the newborns is so high it's near impossible to be successful unless you start in sheer bulk and charge extremely high price upon selling, which were two things we never did. And our friendly Filipino neighbors helping themselves to our rabbits at will, we were not successful. But things would be different here in the U.S., where people, for the most part, don't take what isn't theirs, and the temperatures are perfect for rabbits, and where they are, indigenous. When we started, we went through the very difficult trial and error stage, which lasted several months. Let me tell you, all those YouTube videos that show how easy it is to breed rabbits aren't very accurate. We tried the whole put the mother and the kittens, actual name of baby rabbits, into a nursing box and blah, blah, blah. It was all crap. All of our kittens kept dying, and so we eventually gave up. We turned our rabbits loose. We only had 3 females and 1 male, and figured they'd either get eaten by predators or they would make it on their own in the wild. A month after we'd set our rabbits free, and during which time we'd always seen them lingering around the yard, I walked into our woodshed. It was winter, and I'd gone in to get more wood for the wood stove. One of our female rabbits ran in behind me and scurried into a pile of hay that we had in there, and I immediately began to hear what sounded like suckling. I pulled the top portion of the hay back and saw that the mother rabbit was nursing 6 kittens. And the other 2 females, I'd soon find, also had babies hidden under the hay. We had a total of 22 rabbits now, all alive and healthy, and we were back in business. Realizing that we simply had to let nature run its course, we fenced off a 100 feet long and by 25 feet wide section of one of our fields. We buried 2-inch by 2-inch wide chicken wire 2 feet deep around the bottom of the fencing so that no rabbits could burrow out and no predators could burrow in. And then we simply put up natural structures like stick piles, firewood piles, hay piles, etc. And we turned our new fleet of rabbits loose. In time, we would have as many as 50 rabbits at any given time, even though we were selling on average 20 rabbits per week at $10 a pop on Craigslist. Yes, it turned out we thought our rabbits were too cute to eat, so we never did eat them, and everyone we sold them to were buying them as pets. But then the spring rains came around in April, and we were heartbroken. I will never begin to understand the magic of nature. When female rabbits first get pregnant, they know, and what they do is dig a tunnel about 2 feet underground and then make a tiny cave where they'll give birth to and feed their young. I can't think of any better way to explain the structure than by describing the hedo structures I learned about while fishing in the Philippines. After tunneling down 2 feet and making their little caves, the female rabbits will return to the surface and bury the opening as if they're hiding it, and then they'll never go back to it until about 3 days before they give birth. At this time, they reopen their tunnels and they begin preparing their nest. They actually chew the fur off of their breasts and roll it up with grass and make what looks like a bird's nest down in their underground cave. 3 days later, they give birth, they nurse, and about 21 days after this happens, you walk outside and look in your rabbit pen, and you see anywhere from 4 to 8 little baby bunny rabbits bouncing around that you never even knew you had. It is also magical and exciting. But when the rains came in April, all the underground bunnies died. It was our first spring on the homestead. We had no idea about the water runoff, how it worked on this land, where the land drained well and where it didn't. It turned out that where we'd constructed our rabbit pen just happened to be the worst possible place. The area sits at a low level, just beneath the steepest grade on our land, and it's riddled with underground springs that you'd never know were there unless you'd lived through at least one rainy spring on the land and had already observed it. Our little bunnies took a toll, and by the end of that summer, we were out of rabbit breeding once again, and for good this time. Not because we didn't want to reconstruct a new pen elsewhere, fearing hard work has never been our way, but because of dealing with people. You have no clue how many times people would contact us by way of Craigslist and claim they were coming out at a certain time to buy rabbits and then just never show and never call. Since we lived so far out from the city, we would often set our entire day aside to be here to sell a rabbit for $10, and it was $10 we didn't even need in the first place, and then the buyers never came. Our entire day had been rearranged for naught. So we stopped. We began using our old rabbit pen as a garden spot, and let me tell you, 9 months of rabbit poo going into the soil increased the nitrogen content to the perfect level for growing vegetables. We were getting record-sized zucchini and squash at harvest, and the corn was the sweetest I've ever eaten. The following winter, we put some of our chickens over there to till and fertilize the soil for the next season, but they didn't live through the winter, that damned old Bigfoot Sasquatch, but that's another story for another time. The following year, we planted pumpkins on one half of the garden spot where we'd kept the rabbits, and let me tell you, did we get a bumper crop. I've tried to grow pumpkins every year, and it's hard work because they require a lot of space to vine out and a lot of water to grow their gourds, which are actually a type of squash, but I've never had success. But that year, the conditions were perfect. The space, the soil, the water, and we had dozens upon dozens of pumpkins until the pumpkin munchers came along. I noticed the damage they were doing long before I ever saw them, and technically I've still never seen them. Well, with my naked eyes at least. I'm getting ahead of myself again, so let me explain. I was so excited for our pumpkins that year that every morning after I did my morning run or took my morning bike ride, part of my cool down would include going into the pumpkin patch and seeing how much the pumpkins had grown compared to the day before. I'll never forget that first day, sometime in October, when I walked into the fenced-off pumpkin patch and saw that half of my pumpkins had been halfway eaten. How could this be? I asked myself aloud. The garden was completely fenced in. We shut the gate every night. I got down on my knees to investigate the teeth marks, and I'll be damned if they weren't rabbit teeth marks. How can this be? I said aloud again. We'd buried chicken wire 2 feet deep around the entire perimeter of the cage when we built the rabbit pen, and with all the rabbits we had at one point, none ever escaped and not a single predator ever burrowed in, and we had not removed the wiring. I walked around the entire perimeter of the pen, and I did not see a single breach. It's as if whatever had come into the pen and eaten the pumpkins had flown over the top. But rabbits can't fly, and though they can jump, they can't jump that high. I knew that if I didn't figure this thing out quick, I was going to lose all my pumpkins. They were almost ripe enough to harvest, but not quite. They needed only a few more days. We were well into October, but not quite to Halloween, and I wanted those pumpkins to be perfect so they would become the perfect jack-o'-lanterns. That night, I set one of my trail cams out in the pumpkin patch. I was certain I'd catch whatever was eating my pumpkins on film, and the next morning, to my sheer horror, I found that I had. Okay, so here's the deal. These things, though they looked like rabbits, did not move in any way like rabbits. I watched in fright as the camera footage revealed creatures that looked like rabbits, but with supersized heads, like 3 times the size of regular rabbit heads, crawling out of the soil like Hito coming out of their tunnels to take the coconut grubs, and making their way to the pumpkins and munching on them. They did not hop, and they did not walk. They slithered like a snake, even though they had 4 legs. Their legs simply lay out to their sides as they slithered along, much like fish fins. They'd even flap from time to time, as if these creatures, or at least what I thought were creatures at first, were swimming across the ground surface. We have a live and let live policy on our homestead. We do not kill the wildlife here, nor do we allow others to do so, even though we have an abundance of it, and it's been hell at times trying to garden and grow flowers and trees and ornamental bushes because of all the deer. But our attitude is that we've invaded their land, they didn't invade ours, so we've spent a crap ton of money on fencing and environmentally safe repellents, etc. And yes, I know this makes me sound like a passive hippie, but let me tell you, I'm anything but. I just respect life, and perhaps it's because I've fought in war zones is why. But I'm not an idiot. I have weapons. Because though I do love animals, I have very little trust and faith in people. The next night, I took my .22 caliber rifle into the pumpkin patch with me, and I sat and I waited. And just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard munching. I looked at my direct left where I heard the sound, and damned if I didn't see one of my pumpkins being eaten. But I couldn't see what was eating it. That's right, I could see the pumpkin getting smaller and smaller, and I could see the teeth marks of whatever was eating it being left behind. But for the life of me, I could not see what was eating the pumpkin, even when shining my really bright tactical flashlight on it. I'd been on my land long enough by this time to have seen some really strange things that I couldn't even begin to explain, things that would completely change my way of thinking, and at this time, the thought that instantly came to my head was to pull out my iPhone. I did so, and I switched it to camera mode. I aimed it at the pumpkin that was being eaten, and there in the center of the phone, I saw it. A pumpkin muncher. Something with the body of a rabbit and a head 3 times larger than it should be, lying on its belly, its 4 legs fluttering back and forth lightly as if it were a fish trying to maintain its position in a stream with a light current. I looked around the camera with my naked eye, and again I could see the pumpkin being eaten, but I could not see the pumpkin muncher that was eating it. I looked back into the camera, and sure enough, there it was, a pumpkin muncher. My first instinct was to aim my rifle, by using the camera to do so, at the pumpkin muncher and shoot it, but my better intentions kicked in. Ah, to hell with it, I said, and I got up and I took my gun and my camera and my chair and my light back into the house. I never killed any pumpkin munchers that year, and it cost me in that I never got any pumpkins either. To date, I've never harvested any pumpkins from that pen, though every year I plant a pretty nice crop of them, and they always do well. They always end up being eaten by something that can't be seen with the naked eye, and I'm okay with that. I figure our live and let live policy here on the property has morphed into live and live and only let die once and no need to kill it again, or something like that, even if they are kind of creepy looking little things. But hey, I just view it as if it's all part of the magic of Halloween. The end. So, I hope you enjoyed today's story from October Nights, 31 Tales for the Halloween season, available in print or Kindle, links in the box below. Thanks for being here. I guess we got 8 more stories to go, so we'll be back again tomorrow for more. Hope you can join us. See you then.